Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this presentation on UIElements. It's a new UI system for extending the editor. My name is Benoit. I am product manager.
Hi, my name is Damian. I am an editor developer.
So why UIElements? Well, it's currently difficult to write editor UI code in Unity. I mean, by show of hands, how many of you are using IMGUI? All right. So you should be familiar with these problems. Well, most advanced layouts you do have to be manually calculated. Some simple styling can be surprisingly difficult to do. The event handling is rigid and not extensible. There's no way for you to separate functionality from layout, from styling. So it's overall slow to iterate on complex UI with IMGUI. And on top of that, it's only accessible to developers. So I'm going to show you a demo which illustrates those problems and how UIElements aims at solving them. With special thanks to Slava from the Asset Store for giving us the permission to use the beautiful models and materials I'm going to use for this demo. So for this demo, we're going to pretend that Damian and I are working on a game. Damian is a tool programmer, and I am a level designer. So for this game, I need to build and position turrets across the map to build a level. Turrets like that one. And to build a turret, I need to basically assemble different modules together. So I can select, I have a wide variety of modules to select from. I have different cockpits, I have different weapons. So this allows me to create a wide variety of different turrets for my game. Let me show you how to build one of those. So I start with a base, and each module has a mount point to which I can attach other modules. So basically to this base, I attach a tower. This one has a mounting point as well. I attach a cockpit. The cockpit has many different mounting points, so I can attach accessories and different weapons. This one, so on and so forth. You get the idea. So it's a manual process. And if I want to change, for example, one module up the tree, I need to delete it and restart from there. If I want to change the material of this tower, I need to assign it to each different module. So it can be tedious and time-consuming, especially if I have a lot of those turrets in my game. So I'm wondering if there's a better way to do this. So I'm going to look and ask my tool programmer if he has any ideas to improve this workflow. Damian?
Certainly. Let's see what we can do. Now, if I had to do this today, I would probably use IMGUI, the current API for writing UI in the editor. So let's briefly look at a version of the tool in IMGUI just to see where UIElements is coming from and the kinds of problems we're trying to solve. So here's my tool. If I go to it, we see we have a completed turret. What it really is, it's an empty game object which has this turret component attached to it. And this turret component has a custom inspector, which is the tool itself. You can see here we have slots for all of the different modules that we can add to our turret. And they're arranged in a logical order. We start with the base at the bottom, tower, cockpit, weapons, and backpack. And at the top here, we have a preview of the material that's assigned to the modules. The modules are designed to use the same material so that they all match, even though they're different modules on the turret. And this will let us change the material on all the modules. I can change the different modules here via property fields. So if I choose a different cockpit, and we have a different cockpit, I can also use the scroll wheel to kind of just scroll through different options on these scroll wheels, on these modules. Same with the cockpits and the other modules. And you can see, as I'm doing this, the turret is being regenerated, which means it's actually creating new game objects, remounting them, and doing that. So let's see how this was done in IMGUI real quick. Let's look at the turret mono behavior just to see what the component looks like. I'm just using this to store my selections for the different modules, for the different slots. So I just have some game object fields and the one material field. Now, as some of you probably know, to create a custom inspector, you have to inherit from the editor class and add this attribute to it, where you specify the type of component you're creating an inspector for. Now, I moved all of the code that generates the turret, that creates the game objects and adds them underneath each mount point and also cycles through the modules with the scroll wheel, as well as assigning the materials in this helper turret builder class so that we can focus on just the UI part of this tool. Now, IMGUI is immediate mode, which means that you're drawing the UI every frame. So if you want a button to disappear, well, you just stop drawing it. So that implies we have a loop. This loop is actually, it's called onInspector GUI for the editor. And in here, we can just start immediately drawing our UI. So that's what I'm doing. First thing is the material preview, right, at the very top. Then we have the backpack and the weapons row and so on and so forth. So for simple layouts, this is quite easy to do. You just start drawing, and they'll just appear one after the other. Same if we look at the material preview itself, right? The material preview at the top here. Sorry, this is bugging me. There we go, all fixed. At the top here, we have the material preview, and there's a property field. So I'm just drawing this property field using a built-in layout utility, editor GUI layout, and it will put it in the right place and create the correct rectangle for it. Another easy thing about immediate mode is change detection. So if you want to detect the change, you draw your field, and then you can immediately check if the value has changed. And that's what I do here right away. And then if it has, in my case, I just regenerate the turret. Now, if we want to do something more complicated, this is where IMGUI starts to have some trouble. For example, styles. If we go to the onEnable function, this is where I create my style. Styles in IMGUI are these objects called GUI style. And it's nice, you can create them and then you reuse them as each frame when you draw your UI. So here I'm creating the style for the row. Each row has a different background color than the rest of the inspector because I wanted to reuse the background color for these previews. These previews, by the way, are the same element that draws the preview in, say, the prefab inspector down here. So to create this background, I actually need to create a texture, just a 1x1 texture, set that 1 pixel to the background color I want, then create a GUI style state, and then with that, I can create my style. You can see I'm using that style here for each row. Now, when it comes to layout, there's a couple different ways to do layout in IMGUI. For example, because I want these modules to be centered within the row, right? If I drag this out, they stay centered. What I actually need to do is create these two flexible spaces on either side, so I squish the preview window in the middle. For something like label width, so property fields come with a label, right? And the label has a default width. You can see here in the transform component, the width is pretty large, and I wouldn't even have room for that here. So to change that, I need to change a global state, right? Label width on the editor GUI utility. Now, of course, if I just change this and go on my merry way, I probably screwed up some other part of the UI that wasn't expecting this value. So I have to be nice and remember the original value, and then after drawing all of my rows, which contains all the UI, I have to remember to restore it. This all comes together in this lovely hover border you can hopefully see. We just have a white border on the top and on the bottom of each preview. To do this, I had to use a box. It's literally a box which has, of course, a background color, a white background color, for which, of course, I need to use a new texture, GUI style state, and so on. And for its height, I need to use another GUI layout object called height for what is essentially the border width. Obviously, I need to remember at the very bottom to do the same for the bottom border. So that's layout and styling. Now we come to hierarchy, which is where things get really interesting. So I absolutely insisted that these property fields are drawn on top of this viewport. They're not drawn below it. And that complicates things quite a bit. So to do this in IMGUI, I used this area scope. An area scope you can think of as just like a mini window that you insert arbitrary IMGUI code. And it has its own coordinate space, so it's essentially isolated. Now, all it needs is a rectangle. So I need to give it the actual world space rectangle to which to draw on top. And that should be OK, because we already have a rectangle for drawing our that viewport that we're reusing. So that just comes from this function on interactive preview GUI. It already exists. We're just reusing it. And that function also takes a rectangle. Now, you notice I'm not using the same rectangle here. And that's because initially, when we generate this rectangle, we actually get an invalid rectangle. So it turns out the layout utility actually needs a couple of steps, a couple of frames to figure out the full layout. The first time it runs, it doesn't know what you're going to build later on in the frame, so it returns an invalid rectangle. In the next stage of the frame, let's say the repaint phase, now this rectangle is going to return the correct rectangle. So this is where I actually save that rectangle into a member variable. And that's what I use for the area scope. OK. One other small problem. Since we're drawing this interactive preview GUI first, right? We're drawing it here, line 250. Area scope is line 253. It gets first opportunity to steal my mouse. So when I click here, you can see I can rotate this object even though my mouse is on top of the scene view. And the way it does that is just when you click, it checks if the mouse is on top of itself, of its rectangle. And if it is, it captures it until you let go. What that means is the property field inside my area scope, right, that's drawing on top, even though it's technically on top of the viewport, it just doesn't get any more events. So I need to, again, create a rectangle for it, what I do here. And I need to save that rectangle for use in the next frame, where I check manually if the mouse is on top of the property field. And if it is, then I don't draw that viewport to fix this issue. OK, so now we have some idea of kinds of issues that we're trying to solve with UIElements. So let's actually look at UIElements now. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to rebuild this tool in UIElements step by step. So let's do that. We're going to start with just the basic layout. We just have module previews. You can see here in the same layout as we had with IMGUI. Doesn't do anything yet. To create a custom inspector in UIElements, you, again, inherit from editor, and you have the same attributes. So that pattern is the same. We, of course, have the same plumbing, turret builder, because we didn't change the underlying functionality. We just changed the UI layer. And now the differences start. Main difference being that UIElements is retain mode. So unlike immediate mode, you actually build your UI using objects in a hierarchy, and you give it to the system, and the system will then redraw it as needed with a lot of opportunities to optimize by just not repainting the things that don't change. This also means that we can build a lot of our UI ahead of time. So we actually start building our UI in the onEnable function with this new visual element call. The visual element is the base type of all elements in UIElements. Everything inherits from visual element, and you can, of course, parent visual elements to each other to form your UI hierarchy. So we're just going to use this root element as sort of our inspector element. Because the hierarchy can be pre-built, we can also load part of the hierarchy from an XML-based asset. So that's what I do here. Here, I just load the asset from the asset database. We'll use it in just a second. Same for styles. Styles can be moved to a different file. It's a style sheet. We call it USS, but it's really a strict subset of CSS. And over time, we'll support more and more of the CSS standard. Now, once I have the style sheet, I can, of course, add it immediately to the list of style sheets on the root element. And so any future children that we add to the root element will have these styles applied to them. OK. So we're retain mode, which means we don't drive reframe. So there's no you don't override on inspector GUI. You instead override create inspector GUI. Of course, this runs once and returns a visual element, the root. We already have this root very conveniently, so that's what we return down here. OK, this function will actually be called each time you change targets, which means if you select a different turret, right, you're going to have this function called again. So in this demo, we recreated the whole UI of the inspector each time you change selection. But of course, you don't have to do that. Now, because we're reusing this root element, we have to clear it, make sure that it's clean before we recreate the UI. So once it's clear, we can take that module visual tree asset, the XML asset that we loaded in onEnable, and we can call clone tree on it and give it the root. So what this will do is it will turn the XML into object hierarchy in C#. So we'll just call new visual element for you. It's a good opportunity to look at that file. So it's XML. You can see here we have the rows that we had before in IMGUI, the same basic structure. And inside each row, we have these empty visual elements that will be our module previews. You see here I'm adding classes to each of these elements. So classes here are the same as classes in CSS. They let you assign styles to elements. And also, as we'll see, you can find elements later in C# via querying. You can, of course, assign a name as well. I use the names here to actually link these visual elements with the game object fields that we had on the turret mono behavior. OK, going back to C#. Now that that's all loaded underneath the root element, we can query for elements here. So we're using a feature called UQuery, but it's very similar to jQuery. It lets you just find elements within a tree. And we're just looking for all the elements that have this module preview class assigned to them. Right? So all these named elements here. And for each one, we're adding a child visual element, whatever this function returns, whatever element this function returns. Add just adds a child. So let's see this function. This function takes the module name. It does some plumbing work on the turret builder, and then immediately creates this IMGUI container, which is a visual element. It's a special visual element because it takes, in its constructor, a callback, which serves as an onGUI loop for an IMGUI UI. Essentially, you can embed any IMGUI code inside a visual element like this. And I use this to my advantage because this on-interactive preview GUI, right, which we used before in the IMGUI version of the tool, doesn't have an equivalent yet in UIElements. So I still want to use it. It looks pretty nice. So that's fine. I just put it inside an IMGUI container. Now, back on the outside, this IMGUI container is still a visual element. So I can add a class to it, just like we did in XML. So we can add some styling to it. And by the way, this IMGUI container should help with migration. You don't have to migrate the entire UI all at once from IMGUI to UIElements. You can do it piece by piece as it makes sense. OK, looking at the styling, right? The style sheet that we loaded in onEnable, this is it. If you know CSS, this will be right at home for you because it is pretty much CSS. You have selectors. And this is, we're selecting by class here, and you assign some styling. So we're selecting all the elements that have this module row class. If we go back quickly to XML, these are all of these rows here, module row. And we're saying flex direction row, which makes it so all the children will be laid out horizontally. This is the equivalent to that horizontal scope we had in IMGUI. To center our modules within the row, we use justify content center. There's no need for additional elements on either side. For the background color, there's no need for a texture. You just assign the background color. And we add a small margin, which you probably can't see. But it's there. It's very subtle. For the module viewport, we added this class in C#, right, to the IMGUI container. And I'm just using this to set its width and height. OK. So to bring it all together, just before we move on, let's see the full hierarchy that we've created, partly from XML, partly from C#. And we can use our UIElements debugger to do this. So I can just pick an element here. And we can see here we have the whole inspector. Then we have our rows. And inside each row, we have the module preview. And inside that, what we've actually created in C# is the IMGUI container. On the right here, you can see we have styling information, so we can see where the styles are coming from. Yeah, it's our style sheet. And down here are all the evaluated styles. OK. Moving on. Here we add just the preview for the material. So still can't change anything, but we're making progress. So to add the preview, I'm going to do this all in XML. This is the same XML file we had before. I'm just adding a new row, module row. Within that, I add an element called material. And within that, I add an empty visual element called material image. We'll see how these work together. So that's just my hierarchy. Now, back in C#, I don't have to create any new UI. This is all coming from XML. So I can just worry about things that need to be done at runtime, which is assigning the texture, the main texture of our material, to the background image of our element. So down here, we know our target is a turret. It better be. Then we take the material field that we had on that mono behavior on the turret. We take its main texture, store it. Then we use uQuery again, a short form that just returns one element always. And we query by name this time, just for that material image, that innermost child. And we simply assign it the background image to be the texture from the material. This UI is also how you assign any style to any element. So anything you saw me doing in USS, you can also assign in C# like this. Same names, just slightly different formatting. OK. That's good. So what this is doing is the inner element has a background image, which is the texture. And then the outer element, what I wanted was that element, the texture to be a little bit zoomed in, as you can see here. It's actually quite big. So to achieve this effect, we can do it pretty much all in styling. For the material image, I want it to be fairly large to fit the square texture that is on the material. So I set it to 1,000 by 1,000. Of course, if I just put this element in there, it would push all the other elements apart. So I don't want it to actually contribute to layout. I want to take over myself. So to do that, I set position to absolute. And then I'll give it some coordinates, what I thought was a nice part of the texture. Now, for the material preview, which is just the immediate parent, the outermost, the immediate parent of the material image, what I really want is to make sure the material image, this giant element, doesn't leak out, and you can see it outside. So by default, children will still be visible, even if they're not within their parents' area. So to do that, I just set overflow to hidden, give it a height, and with flex grow, I make it stretch to the size of it, to the width of its parent, so the width of the inspector. This is flexbox in action. OK. So now we're ready to actually make this tool useful and let you change the modules. So we're going to do this by just exposing property fields that directly give you access to those turret game object fields that we had on the component. And so you can see if I change the material, it all works. Same for the modules. So to do that, starting in C#, so starting with the module UI, the module preview. Since we're all doing this in C#, let's add a property field in C#. So we just say new property field, and we give it a serialized property, which will do all the binding for us to the underlying value. We don't have to worry about detecting this and doing this ourselves. And then to put it on top of that viewport, right, that was fairly involved in IMGUI, all I have to do is just add it as a child of this IMGUI container. Children will always be on top of their parent, so that solves the problem. And more importantly, all events will actually, if I click on the property field, you can see it's still working. Because it's on top, it receives the events first. I don't have to worry about that. OK, for the material, since we're doing the material preview in XML, might as well add the property field in XML. That's what I do here. So even though it's a sibling of the material image, remember we set to not contribute to layout. So as far as the property field is concerned, it's all alone on the whole row. Of course, we don't have access to a serialized property here. It's just XML. But all we need to do is set a binding path, which is the name of our field that we're binding to. And then the rest of the binding process will work the same as in C#. For styling, not much to do. It was absolutely crucial that the property field was at the bottom of the previews, not at the top. So to move it to the bottom, I just say justify content flex end. It just means it's at the end of the flex area, so at the bottom. For the material preview, we have the same thing. We want it at the bottom, but we also want it to be centered, so align items center. And we have a width on the field. Now, this will keep it in, the binding system will keep it in sync with the component, the model behavior. But we still want to know when this changes so that we can do some additional work, which is regenerate the turret. So to do that, it's not quite as straightforward as immediate mode, right? Because immediate mode, you were doing the rendering, so you knew exactly when you put that field on the screen, and then you can immediately check if the value has changed. But now we're not in charge of rendering anymore. So we have to use a callback system and events. The event system in UIElements is fairly powerful. The events can be things like keyboard events, mouse events, also custom events that you create, as well as built-in events that certain visual elements will send on their own. Specifically, change event is an event that's sent by any field when its value changes. So the other very important bit is that events, if they're not captured by anybody, they will just continue to propagate up the tree. So we can take advantage of that and just register once on the whole route for this change event. So this will capture all change events from all of our fields right at the root. Now, of course, we still need to know which field changed, so we know which element to update, which module to update. But we can get that from the event target on the event. So from the field, I get the binding path, which gives the module name, and then I do the correct plumbing and regenerate my turret. OK. Now, going back to Unity, I'm not too satisfied with the fact that you can select. I mean, this works, but this also works.
Ew.
Yeah, that looks lovely. OK, let's change it back. I want to make this experience a little bit more catered. So what I want is to be able to cycle through the elements that make sense for that slot and the materials. So as you probably can guess, because you actually seen the end of this talk, I use a scroll wheel. So here it is in action. Just as before, I can cycle through all the materials, and I can cycle through modules, and the turret rebuilds as needed. So to do that, I add another class. You can have as many classes as you want, of course, on your elements. I just add this new preview class on all the elements that I want to capture this scroll event. Then in C#, I just have to, again, use UQuery to find all those elements that I added that new class on and register for a new event, the wheel event. Now I can get, again, the current target, which is going to be the module, the visual element for the preview. And from that, I get the element name, the module name, and cycle through the correct ones. So this function actually just cycles through the modules. It doesn't regenerate the turret. But we don't need to worry about that, because in the process, it's going to change the game object field on the turret, and that will trigger this change event, which we already handle. Then, of course, I have to not forget, very important, to stop propagation of the event. This is the same as in IMGUI. We have event.use very similar because scroll also applies to the inspector, right? So you don't want to scroll the inspector while you're trying to scroll the backpack. Okay. Now I'm almost done, but I feel like this is really nice and interactive, and this does nothing. I'm clicking right now, but nothing's happening. And I just want to do something with that. So what I did is I just let you kind of move that big 1,000 by 1,000 image around with the mouse. So let's quickly see how that was done. We have a concept in UIElements called the manipulator. It's really just a mini state machine of event registrations. So you can see here, I'm using the same API as before to register for 3 events: mouse down, mouse move, mouse up. On mouse down, I activate this manipulator. I capture the mouse on the target, which means that this target is a visual element. So I captured the mouse, which means that from this point forward, all mouse events will only be sent to this visual element. And I also save the current mouse position. In the mouse move, I use the saved mouse position with the current one to get a delta, and then change that top and left coordinate that we initially set in USS through the style API. So this moves the actual element around. Then in mouse up, very importantly, I release the mouse, because if I don't, then the mouse will never work again. Very important you do this. Going back to our inspector, in this area, in the material preview, we query again for the material image. That is that big 1,000 by 1,000 visual element. And we just say add manipulator, and we add our manipulator to it. So at this point, I don't see any possible improvements that I could possibly make on this anymore. So I'm going to pass it back to Benoit, see what he thinks.
Nice. Well, thank you, Damian. That's a great tool. I'm going to save a lot of time with that. Where are you? Oh, okay. So I really like the tool, but I'd like to bring some modifications of my own. For one, it's missing the nice hover effect the IMGUI version had before. So I'd like to bring it back. I'm a bit familiar with CSS, so I'm not going to ask Damian for help, and I'm going to jump straight into my USS file. So I'm going to declare a new class, which I called hoverable, and for it, define a top border and a bottom border, and also have a pseudo class, which is hover. So when the mouse is over my element, it's going to turn the border to white. Pretty simple. All I need to do next is add this class to my visual elements. And it doesn't matter if I add it to a material or a module, the same class is going to behave exactly the same. So let's see what it looks like. Unity, see if it works. Yes, works perfectly. You can see my border. It's not working on my material though. So to understand what's going on, I'm going to use the UIElements debugger. This time to find my element, I'm just going to right-click on it, and it's going to point it to me in my hierarchy. There it is. So this is my texture. What I want to see is its parent right here. So it does have the hoverable style. I can see it here, where it comes from, the value being applied, but it's not showing up. So something's going on, especially since there's a huge gap here. It seems to be the same width as my border. So maybe the image is rendering on top. So I'm going to try to hide it. So with the debugger, I can change any of these CSS value. I'm going to look for visibility, show all the properties. Here, there it is, hide, and then you can see the border. So it's in fact rendering under it. So I'm just going to move the class to its parent. I'm going to go to my file here. Take this, just move it to its parent right here. I'm going to save. And while we're here, I'm just going to reduce the thickness of my border. I think I went crazy a bit here. There you go. Go back to Unity, see if it fixed. There you go. Everything is working fine. And see, I didn't have to recompile. As soon as I went back to Unity, it just loaded the files and reapplied the changes for me right away. One more thing I'd like to do is have my layout here of my modules to better represent the structure of my tower. So I'd like to move these left and right weapons on each side of my cockpit. So I can do that as well. It shouldn't break anything. All right. So I'm going to take this, move it here. Take this guy, move it over here. Again, save, go back. There you go. So yeah, I'm very happy with the result. Great tool. Thanks. That's it for the demo. Oh, thank you. All right, so we've seen that with UIElements, you can do flexible layouts via Flexbox specification implementation. The styling is done via a strict subset of CSS standard. It has an extensible C# event handling inspired by the W3C event model. You can declare your hierarchy in XML and the layout and styling in CSS files, and changing those files do not require any compilation. There's an easy migration path via the IMGUI container in which you can reuse your existing IMGUI code, and it comes with a powerful UI debugger. So what's next for UIElement? It's currently available as an experimental feature in 18.3, and it's going to be released in 19.1. And moving forward, we're going to keep working at making UIElements the default UI framework for Unity. Meanwhile, you can visit the forums if you want to follow development on UIElements. And if you try it, please share your feedback. We really like to know what you think about it. So that's all we have for you today. Thank you. We have some time left for some questions, if you want to use the microphone on each side.
Are there plans to support property drawers, or are property drawers currently supported? Because one of the things that I noticed is you hook into the onEnable event, and with a property drawer, that's a lot different because they're kind of just using the same. So are there hooks that we would have within a property drawer to do hook into the UIElements?
Yeah, it's going to work. Yes, there's going to be support for property drawers. There's actually already support for property drawers. And what I did in onEnable, there's no reason why you can't do that in create inspector GUI, or in case of property drawer, it's create property drawer GUI. So the same hook, it would be very similar to the way I customized the inspector, the editor.
So there is a call then when the target changes?
I'm sorry?
So then there is a callback that we'll have when the target changes in a property drawer, so that we can...
Yeah, it's going to work the same as the inspector.
Right, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks. On the right?
How does it handle like lists or tree views with like 1,000 items or whatever? Does it just tank, or does it know to intelligently just draw what's needed in that array?
So yeah, we have, as part of the release, there's going to be a list view component, a visual element, which will do the proper recycling of elements so that there's only elements for what you see. So as you're scrolling, it just rebinds to the data the same list of elements. So that should work a lot better in UIElements.
Okay. All right.
Same with tree views.
I'm sure this is still pretty early, but I saw on the last slide that you were transitioning the in-game UI system to this. I was just curious, like, kind of if there's like a rough plan for what that'll be, or.
Well, this is an item on the roadmap. We don't have any details to reveal at this time, but we can expect late 19 cycle, some early preview for that feature.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
So that goes pretty closely to what I was going to ask. Is there a potential, maybe late 19, you said, to be able to develop like in-game UI using the USS that you were mentioning, like potential to be able to have those styles for like buttons and menus, et cetera?
So ideally, it would be the exact same framework that you could use to create either editor or runtime menus, which will basically support the same files, the same properties, and all the same features when applicable, of course.
So the artist could create a style sheet and build from there?
That's right.
Yep.
Nice. Excellent. Thank you.
Thanks.
I saw that you mentioned that it doesn't require any compilation to display the GUI, which is great. Thanks for doing that. I was wondering if it's another step further in that if I'm editing code on a separate monitor, will I have to make Unity the active window to see the update, or can I stay in my editor, editing things, saving, and like look over and just see it updating in real time as I save things?
That'd be cool.
It's a wonderful suggestion. Right now, you do have to change focus.
Okay.
But it's
Yes, I would love
yeah,
it.
but that's a good point.
All right, thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, this is fantastic. It's been something I'm waiting for in Unity for a long, long time, so I'm really excited to see where it goes. In terms of where it's currently at, in terms of how you set up the C# class to work with the XML and the CSS, is that sort of like how it's going to be, or is it like a work in progress and a target to move towards maybe a cleaner like MVVM model or something like that, where you have clean view model and bindings and remove some of that code that seems like it might be able to be factored away as boilerplate?
So like an editor, like a UI editor?
Like in how your C# classes, the UI controller classes are structured, basically. Should I rephrase the question?
Yes, please.
Okay. I guess what sort of paradigm are you using for the UI controllers themselves, and is what you're currently using where it's sort of finally going to go? Like, is it an MVC? Is it an MVVM? Or what's the objective?
At this point, we don't want to like impose any of those and see how it would grow and which one would be a better solution for one, or let users define what works best and not impose our own at this point. So
Okay.
no strategy for that, yeah.
Great. Just a short follow-up as well. So when you roll this out to in-game, this is going to be a completely independent UI system, or won't be related to the current Unity UI. Is that correct? Or is
It will be an entirely independent
Okay,
system.
fantastic.
Yeah.
All right, thanks a lot.
No fear.
Hey, just a simple question. The events that you can bind to, I assume you can create your own custom events and then bind to those?
Yeah, you can. Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks. No more
I
questions?
think we're done.
All right. Thanks all.